Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this edition we'll be looking at the Arab Spring and the current upheaval in the Arab world and how Israel is responding to the challenge that is known as the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring started in the beginning of 2011, and since then we've seen the falls of the regimes in Tunisia and in Egypt and Libya, with mounting domestic and international pressure placed upon the Syrian regime, could see the end of Bashar al-Assad maybe within the next few months. What promised to be a new hope and a new dawn in the Middle East that was inspired by socially networking sites as thousands of young Arabs took to the streets to demand their freedom. Almost a year on, and with the implementation of parliamentary and presidential elections in those nations in the Arab world, we're seeing the rise of dangerous Islamist groups who look to benefit in these democratic elections. So we'll be asking, what are the dangers for Israel? The second part of the program would be focusing on Iran, and it was only last week that the Iranian demonstrators demonstrated outside the British embassy in Tehran, which resulted in the British government taking unusual and unprecedented action in expelling the Iranian ambassador and Iranian diplomats from the Iranian embassy here in London. So we'll be asking, what are those consequences of those actions, and has negotiations ended, and are we embarking on a future war with Iran? To discuss these vital and critical issues today, I'm joined once again by Alex Ryvchin, who is part of JewishThinker.org and a spokesman for the British Zionist Federation. Alex, welcome back to the Middle East Report. It's good to have you on the programme again. For some of our viewers, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and the organisations you represent?
Sure. I was born in Kiev in the Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union, to Jewish parents. My family and I migrated to Australia when I was 3.5 years old. My parents understood very early on that, given the deep-seated anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, that my brother and I would never have sort of sufficient opportunities in that country. We were taken in as refugees by Australia, where I was educated and raised, where I met my wife. And I've been involved in advocacy on behalf of the Zionist Federation and writing for the Jewish Thinker as well for a number of years, which is sort of built on my love of Israel, my belief in the Jewish state, and the sense that I have of the need to stand up for the Jewish people.
Yeah. And Alex, haven't we seen incredible things happen in 2011 with the Arab Spring? I mean, we've seen the fall of the regime in Tunisia, then followed by the fall of President Mubarak, and we've seen the demonstration, the protesters in Tahrir Square in Cairo. We've also now seen the fall of Colonel Gaddafi from Libya, and no one would have believed that was possible. And also now huge amounts of pressure being placed upon Bashar al-Assad of Syria, and it's only probably a question of time before we see the end of the Syrian regime. What do you make of the Arab Spring that is really, really shaking the entire Middle East?
I think the Arab Spring has, above all else, created a great deal of uncertainty in the region. With the dictators which have now been replaced, and as you said in the case of al-Assad, seem to be falling, for better or for worse, we knew where we stood. But now we're in a situation where we don't know what will replace these dictatorships, some of which have been in power for decades, some of which come from family lines who have been in there for centuries. And there's a great question as to whether we will see genuine, vibrant democracies take their place, or whether we will see the Islamists, the fundamentalists, which these dictators did so well to keep out of the countries, whether we see them flooding back in. I think there are great implications for Israel and foreign policy consequences, but the Arab Spring is not motivated by foreign policy or by any considerations to do with Israel. They come from a basic desire of the people for democracy, the things that you and I in this country take for granted. The rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and political association, the freedom to blog whatever your political views may be. And I think that these people have a great sense that for too long these dictators have grown rich and fat from the resource wealth of these countries, from the efforts of the people, while the people themselves have lived in abject poverty. So I think that they are very justified in seeking democracy and seeking an end to these dictatorships. But with democracy also comes a grave responsibility, and there's a responsibility on the voters to choose well. We saw in the first free Palestinian elections in 2006, the people of Gaza did not choose well. They elected a terror organization to be their face of the world. So it is incumbent on the voters in these countries to exercise their votes well, because if they choose to elect Islamists, I think they will bear consequences. They will see isolation of their countries, they will see withdrawal of foreign aid, tourism will collapse, foreign investment will collapse, and also there's a great onus on whoever is elected, whether they be Islamist or secular. There is an onus on them to be good governments, and that means ensuring the welfare and protection of minorities in these countries. For example, the Coptic Church in Egypt has seen terrible atrocities perpetrated against it. And there's also an onus on the government to ensure that peace with neighbours is maintained, and where there is no peace, that they reach out for peace. So it's created a great deal of uncertainty. And we may be optimistic as to what will happen, or perhaps pessimistic, but either way I think there's a great responsibility on both the electorate and the elected to act in a certain manner.
I mean, isn't that, I mean, Bush termed this whole concept, I mean, a lot of President Bush's foreign policy, particularly in light of the war in Iraq in 2003, was the implementation of democracy, believing that if the Arab world embraced democracy, then the chances of conflict would recede, because democracies don't go to war against other democracies. But I think one thing we've probably seen this year more than any other year is that you may institute electoral reform, you may allow the people to have the vote, but if you don't build those democratic institutions like a free press, a free parliament, freedom of expression and religious freedom, then all those are simply futile.
Yeah. A true democracy cannot emerge overnight, and as I said, these dictatorships had been in power and had been entrenched for so long, and the people living under them only knew one mode of life, one type of life, and that is living under autocracy and dictatorship. With the fall of these dictators, whilst we hope that there will be a smooth transition to a democracy, and it is true, democracies are rational actors, and they do not engage in war because it's not in the self-interest of the country. But we are very optimistic if we believe that these dictators can be swept out of power and that true, vibrant democracies can take their place. There are no coherent opposition movements. The only real opposition that there has ever been to these dictatorships has been Islamist movements, which have been largely suppressed and forced underground. And there is a very, very grave concern, and we're seeing this in the results of these elections coming in from Tunisia, Morocco, the first round of elections in Egypt, this movement towards Islamists. And it's because these are really the only other alternate organizations. There are no true liberal democracies that the people have a chance to elect. So there is a very grave concern that the dictators will go, but they'll be replaced with something perhaps far worse.
Which then leads me on to my next point, Alex, which I think is very relevant. In terms of American foreign policy or British foreign policy towards the Arab world and the Arab Spring, for so long the United States would say tolerate Mubarak in Egypt, and they may turn a blind eye to many of the human rights abuses that occurred under his regime, or in Saudi Arabia or other Arab states, in order to support stability. Now, isn't there a great danger now, because of the Americans and American foreign policy in particular supporting these new movements in the Middle East, that they're a mixed cocktail? There is so much about the unknown, and by not standing up for people like Mubarak and protecting Mubarak and seeing him fall from power, could bring about something far worse, and that would be an Islamist government committed to Sharia law and effectively wanting to antagonize Israel and possibly start a war with Israel and the West.
Yeah, there is that great concern, and the West was admittedly in a very difficult position. On the one hand, it had to support these movements for democracy. And these movements for democracy, I believe, weren't fueled by a desire from the people to move towards Sharia law or Islamism or extreme forms of Islamic fundamentalism. They arose from a genuine desire for democracy and a better way of life. But in supporting that, the West has essentially destabilized the region. You had dictatorships such as that of Mubarak, which really created a very good state of affairs with Israel, a long-lasting peace to the mutual benefit of both countries. And now with the fall of Mubarak in particular, and with Gaddafi, and without a real vibrant opposition movement and a democracy to take its place, there is a very grave risk that we will go from one extreme form of government, autocracy, to another, being Sharia law.
We've got a clip to go to now, and this is a NATO clip looking at the Arab Spring and the influence of social networking sites in mobilizing so many young Arabs to protest and make a stand against tyranny under their oppressive regimes.
In Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old fruit and vegetable street vendor, set himself on fire on December the 17th, 2010. He was protesting against corrupt local police and authorities. He died on January the 4th. Protests spread following his death, both across the country and the internet. Protesters uploaded videos of unrest, whilst the authorities allegedly fought back with censorship and hacking. But by January the 14th, ex-Tunisian President Ben Ali's 23 years in power were over.
Social media played a role, but not a determinative role. The dominant medium is still television. And part of that is due to the fact that social media are not as pervasive in that part of the world as they are in the more developed nations. You look at Facebook, for example, which is used by only about 5% of the population. Internet penetration throughout the region is about 20%. So that's important, but it's television, on the other hand, reaches upwards of 80% of the population, particularly in the big cities. And so the dominant medium was television, sometimes repurposing material that it found on the social media sites.
In Egypt, a Facebook page called for a day of protest on the 25th of January 2011 over the death of a 28-year-old man named Khaled Said. Police officers had dragged him from an internet cafe and beaten him to death. More than 80,000 people signed up for the protests on the Facebook page. The protests continued in Egypt despite the mobile phone and internet network being down for several days. On February the 11th, ex-Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak's 30 years in power were over. The original Facebook page, called "We Are All Khaled Said," has nearly 1 million likes.
Social media is much broader than sending 144 characters over Twitter or updating your status posts on Facebook. Those are useful, but if you look at how people are sharing videos, how they are sharing information in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, it's primarily through SMS. It's not primarily through Twitter. We observe Twitter, so we give Twitter a lot of credit, but there's a lot more communication going underneath that obvious. The number one enemy, it seems nowadays, in every state in North Africa is Al Jazeera. Whether you're Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, they all blame Al Jazeera for everything that has gone wrong. And Al Jazeera has taken a very aggressive stance, one might say, in broadcasting events, whereas 5-10 years ago, that would have not been possible. So we see a broader dissemination of information. When Al Jazeera's signal is jammed or cut off and there's only state TV, we see people picking up the slack through mobile phones, through telephony, through voice over internet protocol, etc.
You have cases, for example, in Cairo, where there were people who came out into the streets in poor neighborhoods where they didn't even have television. But the ambiance of the city changed. It became a revolutionary city. People were shouting into entryways of apartment houses, "Come join us." It wasn't any fancy technology that was in use there.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Alex, we saw there the impact of social networking sites such as Facebook and Twitter and possibly YouTube as well, plus the influence of television in mobilizing the masses to come and protest against the regime. Do you believe that these forms of media can be used by the democratic and liberal elements within the Arab world to ensure that the Islamists don't take power and don't take hold of these countries?
I would certainly hope so. As we saw there, social media has an incredible power and incredible reach, whereas with these dictatorial regimes, any dissenting view was very quickly stifled and there was only one sort of state position. Social media enabled different perspectives from around the world to be heard. And we certainly hope that with the advent of social media in these countries, that different perspectives, perhaps an Israeli perspective on the Arab-Israeli conflict, a Western perspective, a Christian perspective, these will all be made available to the people and that they will then aid their choices in the interests of democracy. But it does really remain to be seen whether that will happen in any genuine way with the rise of Islamic fundamentalist movements in these countries to replace these dictatorships. Because whilst they lobby largely on anti-corruption lines, which are very admirable, ultimately it will be a broad Islamic agenda which takes place and which comes into effect. And one of those things will inevitably be a limiting of information. So we might be right back where we are now, or before in the pre-dictatorial days, where there is one state line, state position, and that could be as hardline or even more so than that heard from the dictators.
I mean, when this all took place and we saw the fall of Mubarak's regime, the Israeli government responded probably quite naturally, very nervously, fearing that Israel's peace treaty with Egypt, which has now lasted over 32 years, could now be in threat. Now, we know that the most organised group in Egypt are the Muslim Brotherhood, who are affiliated to Hamas, and Hamas in their covenant charter call for the destruction of the State of Israel and the genocide of the Jewish people. Isn't there a great danger that if the Muslim Brotherhood win the majority of parliamentary elections, they can use that as a springboard in order to win the Egyptian presidency and then align themselves with Hamas and the more extreme elements in the Middle East and declaring the peace treaty with Israel over?
Yeah, there's a very grave risk to Israel emerging from events in Egypt. Hosni Mubarak was a very important ally for Israel, largely because he retained the peace that was found by his predecessor. And since his fall, we have seen this great rise in lawlessness in Egypt. We're seeing, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula, we're seeing the rise of extremist movements. We're seeing radicalization there. We've seen the gas pipeline, which supplies both Israel and Jordan, bombed 9 times since the fall of Mubarak. We've seen an infiltration into Israel from the Sinai in a terror attack near Eilat, which left 8 Israelis dead. That would simply not have been possible under Hosni Mubarak. We also saw the storming of the Israeli embassy, which came from very, very little. You had 2 protests, one of which was to do with football hooliganism and the police response to it. Completely apolitical, completely nothing to do with Israel. But somehow these 2 movements unified and found a common enemy, that classic scapegoat of Israel and the Jews. And whilst Mubarak was very capable of suppressing that public sentiment, there is a very grave concern that the Muslim Brotherhood and also the Salafists, who have performed very well in the first round of elections and preach an even more radical form of Islam, that they will exploit this popular hatred of the Jews and of Israel. And ultimately, we're talking about democracy in action, and democracy reflects the will of the people. And the will of the people in Egypt is vehemently anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and anti-Christian. And that presents a very grave risk to Israel. There was a poll in Egypt, an opinion poll recently, which showed that 54% of Egyptians prefer a rescission of the peace treaty with Israel. Now, that is astounding. There is no land in dispute between the 2 countries. They've had peace for some 30 years now, to the mutual benefit of both countries. We've seen economic cooperation, agricultural programs, scientific programs between the 2. There is no reason why anyone should wish to return to a state of war, but the majority of Egyptians have voted for that very thing. So there's a very grave risk that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists will look to, rather than suppress public opinion against Israel, will actually look to play on it. And that will definitely challenge the peace with Israel.
Yeah. I've got another clip to go to now. And this clip focuses on the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu's response to the Arab Spring. where he spoke before Congress in May of this year.
The Middle East stands at a fateful crossroads, for an epic battle is now underway between tyranny and freedom. And like all of you, I pray that the peoples of the region choose the path less traveled, the path of liberty. Israel has always embraced this path. In a region where women are stoned, gays are hanged, Christians are persecuted, Israel stands out. It is different. We have a free press, independent courts, an open economy. Courageous Arab protesters are now struggling to secure these very same rights for their peoples, for their societies. We're proud in Israel that over 1 million Arab citizens of Israel have been enjoying these rights for decades. Of the 300 million Arabs in the Middle East and North Africa, only Israel's Arab citizens enjoy real democratic rights. I want you to stop for a second and think about that. Of those 300 million Arabs, less than 0.5% are truly free, and they're all citizens of Israel. This startling fact reveals a basic truth. Israel is not what is wrong about the Middle East. Israel is what is right about the Middle East.
Welcome back to the Middle East. I think it was Israel's last war with Egypt was the 1973 Yom Kippur War, in which both sides suffered very, very badly. But Israel was denied a political victory after surrounding the Egyptian Third Army Corps led by military general Ariel Sharon, which could have brought the fall of Assad's regime in Egypt. Now looking on, that Israel's had a secure border with Jordan since the signing of the Camp David Peace Accords in 1979. Is there a danger now that Israel now has to start looking at security on a southern border, instead of also having to worry about Judea and Samaria, the Palestinian Authority, but also with Hezbollah in the northern Syria as well, that Israel's borders now are becoming more and more dangerous?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Israel was fortunate to have found a peace with Jordan and a peace with Egypt, which at least meant that on two of its borders, it could count on cooperation, strategic relationships and peace. And as I said earlier, Mubarak was extremely adept at controlling extremism with his own country, not so much out of a desire to protect Israel, but purely to secure his own autocratic rule. He viewed extremism as a challenge to that. But as a consequence, the Sinai was completely demilitarized, but also there was some state of law and order in there. Since the fall of Mubarak, as I said earlier, we've seen the gas pipelines blown up on 9 times. We've seen increasing radicalization amongst the Bedouin community there, and we've seen a very dangerous infiltration in which 8 Israelis died in a terrorist attack. So it is creating that possibility of a new front for Israel, a new area of concern, whereas previously it was a very assured border. So I think that is a new concern for Israel, and I think it's indicative of the broader sort of radicalization of the region and the fact that old dictatorships are now falling and Islamists are taking their place, and that means that no peace can be taken for granted.
And looking at, as well as one of Israel's other closest, probably closest ally in the Arab world, and that's Jordan, and ever since really 1970, with Black September, when Yasser Arafat and the PLO tried to overthrow the Hashemite kingdom, and it was the King Hussein of Jordan at the time put out an emergency call to both the United States and also to Britain, and the Americans responded to the Jordanian call, saying, we're too far away, your only hope is Israel. And so they pleaded with Israel to help, as something like 40,000 tanks from Syria were massing on the Jordanian border to come to the defense of Arafat. And since then, relations with Israel and Jordan have been very, very close, and we saw that in 1995 with the signing of the historic peace agreement with Jordan. Isn't there a great danger now that the Hashemites also feeling the pressure of the Arab Spring and the radicalization and Islamization of Jordan's Palestinian population, which represents 70% of the population, that we're seeing their relationship with Israel start to turn, and they're starting to look towards the Islamists and groups like Hamas?
I think there certainly is that concern. As you said, Jordan is a majority Palestinian state. It was, of course, founded from the British Mandate for Palestine, which saw Transjordan on the east bank of the River Jordan and Israel between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea form out of Palestine. So Jordan is a majority Palestinian state, and it's always had that sort of unrest between the Hashemites and the Palestinians, which has been also precipitated by the refugee problems of Arab Palestinians fleeing the wars in 48-67 and then being taken in by Jordan, where they have been kept in refugee camps rather than being integrated and given full rights as citizens in that country. So there is that great tension there between the two dominant ethnic groups. And I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a broader, effectively a Cold War in the region, where we're seeing the Sunni sect on one side with Saudi Arabia at the helm and the Gulf states, and we're seeing Iran on behalf of the Shiite sect and its satellites battling for supremacy in the region. And there's a very grave concern that Jordan will try and look towards more radical movements, will find common language now with Hamas, and that will certainly pose a great problem for Israel.
Yeah. We've got a clip to go to which focuses on the Jordanians developing closer ties with Hamas.
Hamas's Politburo chief Khalid Mishal is expected to make an official visit to Jordan in the coming days to meet with King Abdullah. An important shift is taking place in Jordan as the country's leaders are starting to take a much more proactive stance in trying to prevent the backlash of the Arab Spring in countries like Syria and Egypt from threatening the Hashemite kingdom's hold on power. Though the Jordanian government lives in deep tension with its majority Palestinian population, part of the evolving Jordanian strategy entails making very public steps to improve its relationship with Hamas. Over the past several weeks, there have been several movements out of Jordan that have been very much out of character for the Hashemite regime, yet have been very revealing of how Jordan is viewing the growing uncertainties in its neighborhood. Jordan is preparing for a visit by Hamas Politburo chief Khalid Mishal, who's currently based in Damascus, to make an official visit to Amman along with Qatar's crown prince after Eid al-Adha. In setting the mood for the upcoming visit, Jordan's new prime minister said Monday that the government's decision in 1999 to expel Hamas leaders, including Mishal, was a, quote, constitutional and political mistake. The Jordanian authorities have a fundamental crisis with the Palestinians. The country's Hashemite rulers were transplanted from the Arabian Peninsula to rule over a territory that is now predominantly inhabited by Palestinians. Jordan thus views groups like Hamas and any bid for Palestinian statehood as a direct threat to the sustainability of the Hashemite monarchy. This is why Jordan has a very healthy relationship with Israel, which shares common cause with the Jordanian government in keeping the Palestinians contained. That said, Jordan does place limits on its relationship with Israel, as it did in '97 when Jordan saved Mishal from an Israeli assassination attempt in Amman. Jordan sees the need to continue to engage Islamist organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. On the domestic front, Jordan has not been immune to demonstrations inspired by the Arab Spring. Most of the demonstrations have been led by the political arm of the Jordanian Brotherhood called the Islamic Action Front. But these demonstrations have been markedly different from those taking place in neighboring Arab countries. Jordan has a much more open relationship with its opposition, and the demonstrations in Jordan have been pretty contained. The opposition in Jordan is very aware of its limits and is not calling for complete regime change. Still, the government doesn't feel like it's completely dodged the bullet, and the Jordanian Brotherhood has been pushing in its negotiations with the government to welcome Hamas back to Amman. Jordan is also looking nervously at the political transition taking place in Egypt. Though Jordan is happy to see the military regime in Egypt maintain control, they can see that the government in Cairo will increasingly have its hands full in trying to contain its domestic opposition while trying to keep Hamas hemmed in Gaza. Then there's the situation in Syria, where al-Assad's political problems are growing. A great deal of tension exists between Jordan and the Syrian regime that's allied with Iran, but Jordan also relied on Syria for a long time to play its part in keeping Hamas in check. A lot of Hamas's finances, for example, run through Hamas's Politburo, which moved to Damascus in 2001. Now that the Syrian regime is distracted, Jordan is growing concerned about Egypt's and Syria's abilities to keep Hamas in check, and is now trying to take matters into its own hands. Jordan also shares an interest with Egypt in trying to distance Hamas from Iran's orbit of influence and deny Iran a strong foothold in the Levant region. On the home front, Jordan's government can also use improving ties with Hamas to gain credibility with the country's Islamist opposition. But Hamas also comes with a lot of baggage. Though Jordan and Israel continue to cooperate very closely, Jordan does not necessarily want to be held responsible by Israel for Hamas's militant actions. Jordan and Israel also don't want to give Hamas an opportunity to gain a strong foothold in Fatah-controlled West Bank to threaten both Jordan and Israel. Still, Jordan may be contemplating the old adage of keeping friends close and enemies closer and making these positive gestures toward Hamas. Hamas also is weighing the merits of warming ties with Jordan. The group understands well that Jordan's intelligence and security apparatus works in very tight coordination with Israel and the United States, and so will be doing whatever it can to clamp down on Hamas's movements. Hamas is looking for a new home, and the Jordanian government may be seriously looking at the prospect of laying out the welcome mat for Hamas for its own strategic interests.
Hello and welcome back to the Middle East Report. Looking at that analysis there, the prospect that Hamas could then soon become the new home to Mashal, who's currently based, the leader of Hamas, who's currently based in Syria, wouldn't that have dangerous implications for the peace process and dangerous implications for Israel's relationship with Jordan?
Yeah, we've seen sort of in the last couple of days this breaking story of Hamas wanting to relocate out of Syria because of al-Assad's actions towards his own people. There's some grave implications from that. I think, firstly, it shows the increasing isolation of the Syrian regime. If Hamas wants nothing to do with you, I think it shows how extreme they've become. But it shows a wedge growing between that triumvirate, which has been in operation for a long time, of Iran being the patron of Syria and also Hamas. So with Hamas trying to distance themselves from that group and perhaps lessen Syria's influence over them, or Iran's influence over them, I think that is a good thing. Hamas is now being courted by the Sunni states, by Qatar, by Turkey. There's talk of Hamas relocating now to Cairo. While that does pose risks, I think there is also perhaps a benefit to come from that. If more moderate states are to be home to Hamas, I think that will lead to some degree of moderacy on Hamas's part. I don't think these states will tolerate the same sort of extremist behavior that we've seen from Hamas based in Syria. But it certainly does pose a challenge, and I think there's another very grave issue here, is that Fatah, which has always been, for all its faults, the more moderate voice of the Palestinian movement, it's becoming more and more isolated and more irrelevant, I think, in the greater region and the greater scheme of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We're seeing now Hamas being courted and Fatah being increasingly isolated and weakened, and that does pose a grave risk for Israel.
And also, we're looking at the peace process. If we actually have one moment, have a look at the peace process. And this is why I think Israel's in such a precarious situation, that if Israel makes peace today, there might be war tomorrow. So if Israel then allows the declaration or a Palestinian state to emerge right on our borders, particularly with the Jordan Valley and with the Jordanian hills overlooking Israel, that within months we could see that Fatah and Mohammed Abbas would be replaced in a coup d'etat by Hamas. Israel would then be locked in with a regime controlling the strategic points over Israel, and Katyusha rockets being fired upon Israel, plus also the danger then that with a future Palestinian state, Hamas would be locked in with Jordan and pose a destabilization effect upon the Hashemites. So, I mean, how can Israel proceed with the peace process with the prospects of this being a frightening and possible reality?
There's a grave challenge there, because when there was a unified Palestinian movement under Yasser Arafat, peace was still not forthcoming, despite incredible offers made at Camp David and prior to that as well. No peace was found. Now we're in a position where the Palestinians seem less prepared for statehood than ever. You've got the Palestinians split both territorially between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, split ideologically between the path advocated by Hamas and advocated by Fatah. They are completely unprepared for statehood, and yet they try and impose a settlement on Israel through unilateral means through the United Nations. Israel desperately wants peace. I think Israel is firmly of the belief that a vibrant and economically stable, politically stable Palestinian state is in Israel's own best interests. And anything that Israel can do to assist in that, in a final, durable and a genuine settlement, it will do. But at this stage, as you said, there are so many issues in play. There is so much division between the Palestinians themselves that the peace process seems to be somewhat illusory at present.
And how can really Israel be expected to make what amounts to incredible territorial concessions for peace when in return she gets rockets? And there is no peace, because peace is about mutual recognition. It's about looking and addressing the education system, as we're seeing with the Palestinian Authority media its education. They're inciting their children to genocide against Israel and the Jewish people. So how can Israel be expected to give away strategic land for peace when there is no peace?
It's a real challenge, and it's a real flaw in the peace process. This notion of land for peace has always been something which Israel has been prepared to buy into, which is what we saw with Egypt and the peace that Israel managed to find there in exchange for giving up the Sinai Peninsula. And it was also the cornerstone of the peace with Jordan. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any way that the Palestinians will be prepared to offer what they need to offer, i.e. peace, in exchange for land. As soon as there is a united Palestinian movement which is capable of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, which is important, because recognition of Israel's right to exist is largely symbolic, but it's the right to exist as a Jewish state, as a Jewish homeland, which is more paramount. But without these even minor steps, there is very little way of seeing a genuine peace developing between Israel and the Palestinians.
And also, which is also very troubling as well, when we're looking at the strategic outlook in the Middle East and looking at Israel's position within the Arab world. And you start to see the real danger with what's happening in Syria right now, with growing domestic pressure on Bashar al-Assad as he's clamping down on the protesters. I think over 4,000 Syrians have been killed. And also Hezbollah is in trouble for supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria as well, and they're both backed by the Iranians. Now, could there be a case where the Iranians feeling increasingly under pressure over their nuclear weapons program? You're having Bashar al-Assad, who's increasingly isolated in the Arab world and in the international court of world opinion, plus also Hezbollah facing trouble as well, that they may instigate a war with Israel in order to deflect that international domestic pressure.
That is a grave concern for Israel. The Arab world has always viewed Israel and the Jews as a very convenient scapegoat. And as soon as al-Assad's trouble started in Syria, this genuine concern emerged that he would use Israel to deflect attention from his own troubles at home, likewise with Lebanon in the north. And that is a very genuine concern. With Iran at the helm, and Iran effectively being the patron of Hezbollah, Hamas and Syria, and as you said, attempting to deflect attention off their nuclear aspirations, there is a real concern that there will be increasing provocations towards Israel from Iran's satellites on Israel's borders, with the aim of extracting an escalation from Israel and drawing Israel into a deeper regional war. And then with that looming spectre of a nuclear Iran, that becomes all the more dangerous.
And really talking about Iran, I mean, we've seen unprecedented news reports over the past week. We've seen those demonstrators organised by Ahmadinejad's own supporters to storm the British embassy in Tehran, which has resulted in Britain, for safety reasons, pulling out the British ambassador to Iran and all the diplomatic staff. And in return, we've seen very, very strong measures by the British government to expel the Iranian ambassador and the diplomatic staff in return. Are we now entering into a new phase in our relationship with Iran, that we're seeing the end of negotiations and almost the start of the beginning of conflict that could lead to regional war?
It looks like we're at a very dangerous point. And I think that's largely due to the world's failure to confront Iran earlier. We had the release of the IAEA's report a short time ago, which confirmed that Iran is seeking to acquire nuclear weapons. But there were no bombshells there, there were no great surprises. It merely confirmed that which Israel had been saying for a number of years. But rather than confronting Iran when the nuclear program was in its infancy, the world instead adopted a policy of appeasement, hoping that by placating Ahmadinejad, he would somehow decide to abandon his nuclear aspirations. But if there's one lesson to be learned from modern history, it's that tyrants will not be appeased. And we've now gotten to a point where, after this report, the world could no longer ignore Iran's nuclear aspirations. And we have seen some meaningful steps to confronting Iran. We've seen the imposition of genuine sanctions. We've seen the downscaling of diplomatic missions from European countries and from Australia as well. Because I think the world has finally come to realize that a nuclear Iran would be a great peril. To have this brutal, repressive, belligerent regime in possession of the most dangerous weapon man has ever conceived is just dangerous beyond words, really. And now we're at a point where it's being confronted in a genuine sense, but one wonders whether it's gotten too far, whether it's too late now to challenge this. There's talk that even a military strike on Iran's nuclear facility would merely delay the development of nuclear weapons. So we're really at a crossroads now in the world's relationship with Iran.
Yeah, we've got a news clip to go to now that looks at the expelling of the Iranian ambassador to Britain and his diplomatic staff, and also the attack on the British embassy in Tehran.
25 Iranian diplomats expelled from Britain have arrived home. They were sent back to Tehran following an attack on the British embassy there. Death to England, shouted the protesters. Dozens of students were at the airport to greet their compatriots, but the diplomats were ushered away. The row brings relations between the two countries to a new low, but diplomatic ties have not been cut entirely. We've come here to welcome the Iranian ambassador from the UK, he says. We're very happy that they've returned. We don't need an Iranian embassy there. In London, the expulsion brought protests against the Tehran regime outside the Iranian embassy. Behind the dispute lies the ongoing saga over Iran's nuclear program. Britain's move, along with the US and Canada, to impose new sanctions prompted last Tuesday's attack on the British embassy in Tehran. Iran apologized, but the UK accuses the authorities of backing the protests.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Alex, I'm just looking at some of the news headlines, and this is from the Telegraph on Tuesday. It says Iran's forces ordered to be ready for war. Iran's Revolutionary Guards have been put on a war footing amid increasing signs that the West is taking direct action to cripple the country's nuclear program. And we've also seen a proxy war going on in Iran. I mean, we've seen only a few weeks ago the attack on Iran's Shihab-3 missile base with a devastating impact. We've also seen an attack on Iran's nuclear weapons base, I think it's in Isfahan, only last week. And plus also the assassination of many leading Iranian scientists. Is there a danger that this proxy war could lead to a wider war?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a challenge to Iran's nuclear program through somewhat unconventional means. We've seen the measures that you've spoken about. Prior to that, we've seen the Stuxnet virus infect Iran's IT systems, which set back their nuclear program by a good deal of time. I think the world is getting serious. I think the world is starting to understand the gravity of a nuclear Iran, and it's looking for ways to confront this. And a full-blown military strike is in nobody's best interest. No one wants this. There's also questions as to its effectiveness also. So I think the world is looking for more creative ways to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear capability. And in their response, in mobilizing their Revolutionary Guard, I think we're seeing an increasing isolation and desperation on the part of Iran. They realize they're now finally in a position where they need to either disarm, halt their program, or face dire military consequences. And through those actions, I think we see that they have no intention of disarming whatsoever.
I mean, what's also interesting as well is that in recent weeks we've seen the rhetoric from the Israeli government. We've seen Ehud Barak, we've seen the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talking about that if the West doesn't take more serious action against Iran, then Israel would be forced into taking on military action against the Iranian regime, which is something they don't want to do, but feel they have no choice because of the statements that have been made by Ahmadinejad that he has vowed to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So the prospect of Iran having nuclear weapons will increase their sponsorship of international terrorism. It means this will safeguard them against any future attacks, and the world will be a more dangerous and darker place. Is it coming to that place where we're getting to almost the countdown stage of Israel being forced to take action because of the weakness of the United States government in confronting the threat and the terror posed by the Iranian regime?
I fear that this is where we have gotten to. A nuclear Iran is not just an Israeli problem, and Israel has been saying that for a number of years. Nuclear proliferation is in nobody's best interest, particularly, as I said, when that weapon would be in the possession of such a brutal and belligerent regime. The consequences of a nuclear Iran span, as I said, far beyond Israel. We are talking about Iran trying to increase its presence in the Persian Gulf, trying to displace US influence there, trying to arm itself in its Cold War against the Saudis and their influence over the Gulf states. So that grave consequences will come from a nuclear Iran, and they're not just confined to Israel. From Israel's perspective, however, they simply cannot and will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear capability. Israel's survival has always been predicated on possessing a military capability greater than that of its combined enemies. And with Iran potentially acquiring a nuclear weapon, that peace which Israel enjoys, which it clings to, could be shattered. Now, I don't think we will see a nuclear strike from Iran. That would be a totally irrational act from an admittedly irrational state. But I think what we will see is an escalation in hostilities by Iran through its proxies, through Hezbollah, through the desperate regime of al-Assad, and through Hamas, with the hope of then dragging Israel into a regional war. And that is something which Israel does not want. It needs the ability to protect itself, and it simply will not tolerate a nuclear Iran. And I think we have sadly gotten to that point where if the world is not prepared to confront this global problem, I think Israel will have to act unilaterally and do so.
Alex, looking at really, I mean, it's been a very, very eventful year, 2011 in the Middle East. What is your analysis of 2012, and particularly Israel's position in the Middle East?
Well, looking back on the year, it's been a very challenging one, and I think it would be easy to take a good deal of pessimism into the new year, but I prefer to look at the good things which have come in the last year. We've seen the freedom of Gilad Shalit after 5.5 years of terrible, terrible state of affairs, of effectively being buried underground, kept hostage, having no contact with his family. And after 5.5 years, he's now back with his family, which is a wonderful thing. We've seen increased tourism to Israel. We saw 3.2 million tourists come through Ben Gurion Airport, and that's an opportunity. This is 3.2 million people who are seeing Israel firsthand, seeing what a miracle this is, this vibrant young country born out of the desert. And I hope that through that tourism, people will have a greater appreciation for Israel, the culture there, the nightlife, the cohesive society there, and it will give them a new perspective on the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I think is very important. We've seen wonderful advancements in medicine, chemotherapy treatments, AIDS treatments coming from Israel, wonderful projects in agriculture. So I think a lot of good has also come from this year, and I'm very optimistic for the coming year. But that's not to say that Israel doesn't face very serious challenges. We are seeing, as we've spoken about, a nuclear Iran. We're seeing great uncertainty come from the Arab Spring, the fall of stable governments, albeit dictatorships, only to be replaced by Islamists, which pose a great threat. We're seeing the increasing marginalization of more peace-seeking Palestinian movements and the elevation of militant Palestinian movements. So Israel faces great threats, but I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful. Through every potential risk, I think there's an opportunity. And Israel will not miss the chance to seize peace if it presents itself.
Yeah. Got about 3 minutes left of the programme, Alex. Have you got a message for our Christian viewers?
Well, as always, the Jews and the Zionist Federation are deeply grateful to the Christian community for their support. As we've discussed on the programme, Israel faces unprecedented threats, nuclear Iran, instability on its borders. It faces a relentless war of delegitimization in the media, in the United Nations, on campuses. And Israel cannot do this alone. It cannot stand up alone. It desperately needs the help of the Christian Friends of Israel. And we are deeply indebted to the Christians for the support that they give to the Jewish state.
And what practical steps can our wonderful viewers who have a tremendous passion and love for Israel and the Jewish people, how can they get involved in helping Israel and the Jewish people?
Well, advocacy on all levels is very, very important, whether it be through letter writing to mainstream media, whether it be phoning into radio stations, joining groups to discuss tactics for advocacy. There is obviously a very strong Jewish voice in support of Israel, but a Christian voice being non-partisan, not being linked to either of the two groups involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict, is a lot more powerful, it's a lot more evocative, it gets through to people a lot more. So anything the Christian community can do, whether it be lobbying their members of parliament, writing letters in support of Israel, it all plays a very important part.
That's excellent. And also, Mazel Tov. Congratulations that you and your wife have decided to make Aliyah to go and live in Israel. I think we're down only a couple of minutes. What do you think your new life will be like in Israel?
I think it'll be a challenge in many ways. I mean, materially, we'll have to sacrifice a lot. The standard of living generally in Israel is lower than here. Salaries are lower. But I think overall it will be an incredibly enriching and fulfilling life. I think everyone needs to know what it's like to live in their home country, in the land of their ancestors. And for me as a Jew, that's Israel. And I think it's time to end the exile and to come home, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Alex, I want to thank you again for being my guest today on the Middle East Report to explain what's happening with the Arab Spring and particularly Israel's position. And I want to thank you all for watching today's Middle East Report. And I think it highlights the importance of standing with Israel. She faces increasingly hostile and environment in the Middle East, and it's up to us to make a stand with Israel and the Jewish people, and to raise our voice against injustice and against evil, as we're seeing from the Iranian regime. So thank you very much for watching the Middle East Report, and we'll leave you with this song that one day maybe the Arab world and Iran would embrace true democracy and peace with Israel.
When I gave the word, now in the morning I sleep alone, sweep the streets I used to own. I used to roll the dice, feel the fear in my enemy's eyes. Listen as the crowd would sing. Now the old king is dead, long live the king. 1 minute I held the key. Next the walls were closed on me, and I discovered that my castle stand upon pillars of salt and pillars of sand. I hear Jerusalem bells are ringing, Roman cavalry choirs are singing. My sword and shield, my missionaries in a foreign field. For some reason I can't explain, once you've gone there was never an honest word. That was when I